She just moved too fast.
That's what Rena Mallow, interim president of the Virewood Bluffs HOA, told the crowd after she fired the shot. My daughter, Elira, collapsed right there under the driftwood arch I'd built with my own hands. A wedding veil soaked in red, barefoot guests screaming. And Rena? She holstered her pistol like she'd just dealt with a wild animal. She startled me. She made an aggressive motion, she added with that tight smile, like the gunpowder hadn't just ripped open a living person's skin. But I'd seen the arc of her arms, the direction of the muzzle, the timing. Rena hadn't fired in fear. She fired in control. And that arch? I angled it westward for lighting, so I know exactly where the bullet came from. You might want to keep reading, because when a woman in HOA polyester tries to rewrite a crime scene in real time, while my daughter bleeds out beneath the vows she never got to finish, you'll want to see what I did next. Subscribe now, because what happens after this shot? You won't believe how far she went to cover it up. My name is Cassian Reese. I spent 15 years investigating battlefield incidents for the Army's Criminal Investigation Division. I'm a certified forensic reconstructionist and a licensed private auditor for insurance fraud, structural sabotage, and wrongful injury. I'm not just some father who panicked. I'm the guy you call when bullets don't make sense. But today, I wasn't here to build a case. I was here to watch my daughter marry the man she loved under the same arch her mother once stood beneath, before cancer ate her from the inside out. Elira asked me to use the pier wood from our old lake house, the one I almost sold when grief clouded everything. We laid it in curved branches, wrapped in baby's breath and threadlights. She said it made her feel like her mother was watching. And now, it's the backdrop to a shooting, one the HOA is already scrambling to sanitize. When the EMTs arrived, Rena pulled them aside. I saw her whispering, clipboard already in hand, her HOA badge swinging in the sun like it meant something. She had no authority to be armed, no formal position beyond what she illegally declared, but she still managed to take control of the scene. Active threat contained, she wrote in her little notebook. Community secure, no further escalation. My daughter was seizing on the floor, and this woman was logging it like a safety drill. What infuriates me most? Rena's not new to this. She's the one who fined a 6-year-old for unauthorized chalk drawings on her own driveway. She once demanded biometric guest lists before allowing a baby shower to proceed near the community green. She filed emergency patrol amendments into HOA sub-bylaws, documents never ratified, but somehow always printed with her signature. Everyone in Virewood Bluffs knows her, but they never saw her as dangerous. Just overbearing, procedural, maybe a little paranoid. But I know weapon control, I know trajectory. I know the gap between where Rena stood and where Elira fell. And something else stood out. There was no panic in Rena's face when she raised that gun. No flinch, no hesitation. The HOA was quick to call it a discharge of protocol. The message went out via community text alert within minutes. We regret a necessary response was triggered due to unregistered guest movement. Situation stabilized. Please remain calm. Unregistered guest movement? You mean the flower girl who dropped her basket? The barefoot bridesmaid who reached for her? No one lunged, no one yelled, no one threatened. I kept pressure on Elira's wound with one hand while I snapped mental photographs with the other. Blood soaked my dress shirt. Her fiancé screamed for help. But all I focused on was angle, wind, distance, recoil pattern. Because Rena Mallow hadn't just ruined a wedding. She'd fired a bullet on communal HOA land, with no deputized authority. Using a sidearm she had no license to carry during residential events. And I was already building the case to bury her with it. Where are you watching from? Because trust me, what came next wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't a petition. It was a forensic takedown. And Rena never saw it coming. The HOA set up their so-called emergency coordination hub beside the courtyard before the last guest even stopped screaming. It wasn't a medical tent. It wasn't even staffed by anyone with basic CPR certification. It was just a folding table, a stack of incident forms, and 3 board members acting like clipboards could stop bleeding. I carried Elira past them as the EMTs rushed her toward the ambulance. But I didn't miss the way those board members avoided my eyes, as if looking directly at me might make the truth harder to bury. One of them, Corin Vestal, the HOA's compliance officer, was already rehearsing his phrasing. I recognized the rhythm. I've heard it from guilty soldiers, panicked contractors, and supervisors who smelled liability leaking through the walls. He kept repeating unfortunate escalation under his breath, like if he said it enough times, it would become official record. When I came back from the ambulance bay, blood still drying on my hands, the first aid station was buzzing with HOA people more than medical staff. Rena sat at the center of it, legs crossed, chin high, giving her statement to 2 volunteer security stewards she appointed herself months ago. She looked like a queen reviewing her loyal subjects. She made a rapid, threatening movement, Rena said. The child could have been in danger. I responded according to Section 7. Section 7. They always invoke Section 7 when they want to appear legitimate. It's a portion of the bylaws meant for vendor misconduct and construction hazards, not weddings, not children, and definitely not gunfire. Watching her recite it like scripture made something cold slide into my chest. A couple of neighbors murmured nearby. One woman clutched her husband's arm and whispered, "This is the 3rd time she's drawn that thing." I overheard every word. Another man added quietly, "She flashed it at the landscaper last month, said he a step too close to the irrigation lines." So, this wasn't new. People had seen the signs. They'd shrugged them off because Rena wrapped her paranoia in HOA policy jargon. And when someone quotes bylaws with enough confidence, everyone else folds. I stepped closer to the table, and the board members stiffened like they expected me to flip the whole thing over. Maybe I wanted to. Maybe I should have. But I've learned something over the years. Fury doesn't win. Facts do. Facts, properly gathered, properly preserved. They break through lies like steel through paper. Corin cleared his throat when he saw me. "Mr. Reese, we're formalizing the preliminary community report." Community report, not police report, not witness statement. They were trying to get ahead of the narrative, to publish something so official-looking that it would lock neighbors into a version of events before anyone spoke to actual investigators. "I haven't even finished giving mine," I said. My voice came out low and steady. That surprised me. Inside, I was vibrating. "We're gathering everything," Corin replied, shifting his weight. His eyes kept darting to Rena, not me. "We're ensuring the HOA's documentation aligns." Aligns, not reflects, not records, aligns. Rena looked up at me then. Her expression was controlled, almost bored. "Cassian, I know this is difficult, but we have to follow protocol. A guest caused an unsafe moment. I intervened." A guest. She couldn't even say my daughter's name. "She was reaching to help the flower girl," I said. "That's the unsafe moment you're talking about." Rena blinked once, slowly. "Movement is movement. Threat perception." "Perception," I repeated, letting the word hang. "Not reality." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. She didn't have to. The rest of the board members watched her for cues, waiting for her next line so they could parrot it like obedient proxies. While they reviewed their fabricated versions of the truth, I stepped aside and crouched near the edge of the courtyard path. It was a different angle from where I stabilized Elira earlier. I could see the faint glint of blood drops leading toward the ambulance bay. But more importantly, I could see the spot where Rena had stood, the sharp imprint of her heel in the soft lawn, the footprint alignment aimed nowhere near the supposed lunge. Neighbors walked around me carefully, whispering things they hoped the board wouldn't hear. One man said the shot came too fast for any real threat. Another admitted Rena had been arguing about unauthorized movement near her perimeter before the ceremony even started. And one older woman said, "She always escalates. Always." I listened. Every comment added weight to the direction I already felt myself moving. When I stood up again, the board was still trying to mass-produce their version of the truth. They didn't see the way the neighbors avoided them. Didn't notice the way the courtyard had shifted from celebration to quiet rebellion. They thought they still had control, but they had no idea how fast control dissolves when someone who understands evidence starts paying attention. The next morning, I stood outside the HOA's administrative building, watching the board walk in like nothing had happened. Just past the flagstone path, beneath 2 ornamental cherry trees, they moved with careful choreography. Coffee in hand, clipboards under arm, dressed in regulation polos with embroidered HOA logos. If you'd told a stranger someone had opened fire in front of guests the night before, they'd have laughed. No one looked rattled. No one looked ashamed. And Rena Mallow, she walked like the shot she fired had solved a problem. Inside the conference room, she had the blinds half drawn and the air conditioning set too cold. It always was. She called it a discipline thing. She said discomfort kept minds sharp. That morning, the table was stacked with reprinted bylaw packets and a new draft titled Post-Incident Response Framework. I saw my daughter's name nowhere in it. Orrin Hale sat at the far end of the table, quiet, thin, pale, and always slightly hunched. Orrin was the HOA secretary, a role most people forgot even existed. But I didn't. I watched his hands shake as he paged through the meeting minutes, eyes flicking up every time Rena spoke. She called the meeting to order with her usual crispness, never once acknowledging the shooting for what it was. An incident occurred, she said, and as your acting president, I moved swiftly. I would do so again. This board was built to uphold order in Virewood Bluffs. A couple of members nodded without commitment. One cleared her throat but didn't speak. Orrin looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. They reviewed the security protocol revisions, then moved into assigning blame. According to Rena, my daughter's wedding had created high emotional volatility, and the layout of the event introduced perimeter ambiguity. Her wording was absurd. She made a celebration sound like a riot, but no one interrupted her. Not yet. When I stood up in the back, all heads turned. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I didn't care. I spoke quietly. I saw the trajectory. I know the angle she stood. I know where the bullet landed. Rena's expression didn't flicker. Mr. Reese, this is a closed board session. I didn't move. And this is an open crime scene. You didn't have authority to carry a weapon on HOA grounds. You had no certification. And you filed emergency protocol addendums that never went through vote. Orrin flinched. Rena didn't. I filed under interim executive authority, she replied. Article 4C grants emergency scope in absence of full quorum. Not if no one authorized you to declare quorum in the first place. Silence. Rena reached for her pen. Orrin stared at his lap like it might open and swallow him whole. He'd been there. He knew when those votes happened, and more importantly, when they didn't. He'd recorded the minutes. He'd seen the gaps. I turned toward him. Not accusatory, not demanding, just letting the weight of the moment settle. Orrin, I said, calm and steady. You're the one with the records. You know what passed and what didn't. You signed off on every version of the policy archive. You know Rena was never elected interim by any legitimate measure. You were there. His hands froze. His knuckles blanched. I saw his lips part, then shut again. For a second, the room stopped breathing. Rena leaned forward. Mr. Hale, I hope you're not suggesting this board acted improperly. That would be... Orrin shook his head, barely. No, of course not. But his voice cracked. The silence after hung like a dropped verdict. I left the meeting without another word. I didn't need to press him. Not yet. A man carrying guilt like that eventually puts it down. Outside, the air felt heavier. The sky was too clear for the way my chest was tightening. A text buzzed my phone. It was the hospital. Elira was stable, but still unconscious. The wound hadn't hit the heart, but it had fractured a rib and clipped a branch of her left subclavian artery. She was lucky. That's what they kept saying. But luck doesn't clear a trigger pull. Luck doesn't authorize a weapon. And luck doesn't get to define the truth. Rena could hide behind bylaws all she wanted. Orrin could tremble behind silence. But the facts were already forming their shape. And I wasn't building a case anymore. I was building a reckoning. That afternoon, a notice was taped to my front door. The paper fluttered slightly in the wind, held in place with official Virewood Bluffs HOA tape. Blue logo, serif font, clean borders. It would have looked bureaucratic to anyone else. But I knew better. Violation. Notice, event interference, and unsafe assembly. The ink wasn't even dry before my jaw tightened. I tore it down and scanned the lines. Rena had filed it personally. Claimed my daughter's wedding created a sustained disturbance of safety thresholds. She cited non-compliance with amended guest tracking, lack of security liaison approval, and exceeding perimeter occupancy by 11. 11. The number didn't matter. The intent did. This was retaliation disguised as regulation. She wasn't trying to restore order. She was trying to bury her mistake under paperwork, as if citations could overwrite trauma. They had marked the wedding arch as unauthorized installation, a violation, the same arch my daughter chose to stand beneath in honor of her mother. Rena had flagged it as a sightline obstruction. I stood on the porch holding that notice, watching two board members in beige polos walk briskly past my yard. Neither met my eyes. They didn't need to. The message was clear. They'd chosen silence. My phone buzzed. It was a message from one of the guests, sent quietly, no subject line, just a video clip. I tapped it. The phone shook slightly as the guest had recorded it, hiding the camera low by their hip. In the frame, Rena stood just behind the flower arch, hand on her holstered pistol, scanning the crowd. You could hear music playing, the sound of chairs creaking as people shifted. Then, a child's laugh. The flower girl, no doubt. One of the bridesmaids reached toward her. The moment was delicate, gentle. And then Rena pulled. No warning, no command. Just the sharp crack of a round and gasps from every direction. The clip ended before the screams fully rose. But it was enough. Enough to prove timing. Enough to destroy the idea of threat response. There had been no escalation, just preemption. I saved it to multiple drives immediately. Later that evening, I went back to Sylvan Court. The blood had been power washed, the petals cleared, the chairs removed. But I could still see it. The space where Elira fell, the exact alignment of the driftwood arch and the path where Rena had stood. I brought a laser rangefinder and my angle kit. Not for court, not yet, for certainty. 24 feet between muzzle and victim. 7-degree downward angle based on trajectory. I adjusted for the slope. Even without full reconstruction, I already knew. Rena had aimed, not reacted. The board wanted to treat this like a paperwork error, a policy misstep. But this wasn't about codes. This was about control. I returned home to find my inbox filled with new automated messages. One for unauthorized disturbance of communal green space. Another for external light violations during after-hours congregation. 3 separate fines in less than 12 hours. She was flooding the system, hoping I'd drown in it. But the mistake Rena made was assuming I didn't know the system better than she did. When I served in CID, I worked cases that made this look like kindergarten politics. I'd traced bullet trajectories through jungle foliage and reconstructed black site ambushes with only bone fragments and exit wounds to work with. HOA bureaucracy, that was paper, and paper burns when truth gets hot enough. I pulled out Elira's printed wedding layout, filed, approved, stamped by the HOA 2 weeks ago. I laid it side by side with Rena's fabricated violation list. Dozens of contradictions. They'd greenlit the exact head count they now claimed was excessive. The arch had been reviewed by the Structural Compliance Subcommittee and photographed for the HOA event brochure. It wasn't just authorized, it was featured. They weren't. Erasing evidence. They were rewriting it. That's when I knew. This wasn't panic. It wasn't incompetence. It was a deliberate cover-up, backed by signatures and silence. I opened my investigation log. Page 1, time-stamped and secure. Underlined across the top, pattern of post-incident retaliation. Primary actor, Rena Mallow. Mechanism, weaponized violation system. She wanted this buried in HOA process. I was going to exhume it, one forge clause at a time. I stared at the PDF on my screen for the 3rd time that night, jaw locked. Something about the document felt off, but I couldn't name it yet. It was the so-called Emergency Authority Addendum Rena had submitted, attached to the HOA's mass email earlier that day. Her claim was simple. As acting president, she had declared a private event risk mitigation plan and enacted Section 4.3.1, allowing weapon carry in high-tension communal events. No one challenged it because it looked real, but real policy doesn't hide in metadata. I opened the file in my forensic audit toolset. Not Adobe, not Preview, the suite I'd used back in Germany to trace backdated compliance reports to a fraud ring that nearly bankrupted an allied housing compound. That software had never let me down, and it didn't this time either. The first thing I noticed was the timestamp, 12:42 p.m., day of the wedding. The document claimed to have been created months prior, but its embedded creation data didn't lie. It had been generated less than 3 hours before Elira was shot. No internal version history, no prior edits, no stored drafts. That meant the document wasn't revised. It was forged from scratch. Worse, the signature block listed all board members, but only Rena's name was embedded in active text. The others were static, flattened into the PDF as part of the image. A digital trick to make it look signed when it wasn't. I scrolled down and saw something even more damning. Language lifted verbatim from a county sheriff policy manual. I recognized phrases like incident de-escalation perimeter response protocol and armed standby posture, all legal-sounding jargon that had no place in an HOA document. She'd copied them from something she found online, mashed them into a fabricated clause, and passed it off as authority. I cross-checked the HOA's master records, pulled from a previous transparency request I'd submitted when Rena first started her rule-bending a year ago. There was no version of Section 4.3.1 in any formal document. It didn't exist. She'd made it up, invented an entire bylaw, wrapped it in professional formatting, and shoved it into public view, hoping no one would look deeper. It worked until now. I grabbed my old field logbook and began documenting. Exhibit A, metadata timestamps, confirmed doc creation date mismatched with claimed ratification. Exhibit B, non-existent clause, 4.3.1, unsupported in any ratified version of HOA bylaws. Exhibit C, forged. Signatories, visual overlays, not embedded fields. Exhibit D, language origin, cut from public sheriff policy documents, not HOA legislation. Every page I added narrowed the walls around her. At 1:11 a.m., I backed up the findings to an encrypted drive and uploaded a duplicate to a cloud server. Redundancy matters. I've seen people vanish documents like smoke. I wasn't going to let that happen again. Just before logging off, I checked one last detail, the file properties inside her PDF. Hidden deep in the author tab, her initials. RM, her laptop name, Vire Prez 01. Not even subtle. It was the equivalent of leaving fingerprints at a crime scene. The next morning, I printed 3 physical copies of the report. One for me, one for my attorney, and one that would sit, sealed and time-stamped, in a fireproof box until I needed it. Elira was still unconscious. I visited her before sunrise. Machines beeped softly around her. Her fiancé slept in the hospital chair beside her with his head against her hand. I didn't wake him. I just stood there and watched the rise and fall of her chest. When the doctors spoke later that morning, they said the bullet had missed her spine by 3 centimeters. If she'd turned half a second later, if she'd reached an inch higher toward the flower girl, Rena's story wouldn't be a lie. It would be a eulogy. And maybe that's what cut deepest, how close it had come to being irreversible, all justified by a document born from a lie. I walked out of the hospital, keys in hand, breath steady. Because now, I didn't just suspect Rena had faked her authority. I could prove it. The hospital's walls were too clean, too quiet. I hated that silence, how it made everything feel frozen. Elira hadn't woken up yet. The machines still did all the talking. Her fiancé Devin looked up when I stepped in. He didn't say anything, just gave a slow nod before turning back to her. There was nothing left to say. We were all just waiting. I stood beside her bed and studied the faint line of stitches across her shoulder and collarbone. It wasn't just skin. I knew what that kind of shot could do, how close the artery had been, how easy it would have been to miss that emergency window. I knew the math. 3 centimeters. That's what separated us from a funeral. The nurse came in to adjust the IV. She looked like she'd rehearsed her words for worried fathers, but I didn't need comfort. I needed time, and I was running out of it. Rena's version of the story had already started spreading. Neighbors who hadn't even been there were now repeating phrases like unregistered guest and reactionary protocol. It wasn't just paperwork now. It was propaganda. I stepped into the hallway, heart still pounding from a dream I hadn't even been asleep long enough to finish. My phone buzzed. It was another message, a new file. I opened it. This one came from a neighbor, someone I hadn't even spoken to. The subject line read, "You didn't get this from me." The attachment was a voicemail recording, captured from their answering system. The timestamp? 23 minutes after the shooting. Rena's voice came through, calm and smooth. There was a scare, but I handled it. I'll have the HOA board back the policy insert I uploaded today. Just need Oren to keep quiet until the next review vote. He won't make noise. I listened twice, then a third time. I uploaded today. She said it outright. No hesitation, no cover. She admitted the bylaw was freshly added. No board vote, no community notification, no prior record. And she acknowledged Oren, that he knew, that his silence was part of the plan. I knew what I had to do. I left the hospital and drove straight to the HOA office. Not to confront Rena, not yet. I wasn't done stacking evidence. But I had one move left to make before the next board meeting. I needed to look Oren Hale in the eye. I found him in his car parked behind the building, engine off, staring straight ahead like the windshield held answers he couldn't reach. I knocked on the window once. He jumped. "Mind if I sit?" I asked. He hesitated, then unlocked the door. Inside, the silence between us was tight. I didn't start with threats, didn't even ask for anything. I just pulled out my phone, opened the voicemail, and hit play. Oren didn't blink, but his knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "I didn't know she recorded that," he said softly after it ended. "But she was right," I told him. "You did know. You signed off on the meeting minutes. You saw the proxy votes. You saw the amendment dates." His breath hitched. "She told me it was temporary," he muttered. "Said it was just a procedural formality, that she'd formalize it after the fact, once the community cooled down. She told that to a lot of people, but she's not going to tell it to a grand jury. That's where I come in." Oren turned his head slowly. His face was pale, drawn, but something shifted behind his eyes. Not fear, not yet, but doubt, the kind that cracks before it crumbles. "I never wanted this," he whispered. "I didn't vote for her." "But you signed under her," I said. "That makes you complicit, until you don't want to be." We sat in silence. The air smelled like dust and plastic dashboard. I could hear his breathing, quick, uneven. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "No," I told him. "Don't. You already know the answer." He didn't argue. I stepped out, closed the door, and didn't look back. When I got home, the courtyard arch had been taken down. No notice, no warning, just gone. In its place was a flattened patch of grass and a yellow marker labeled Unapproved Structure Site. Rena was trying to erase everything, but she didn't know I already had the entire wedding layout on file. Photos, permits, signed approvals. She could pull up every stake and wipe every surface. I had everything I needed to put it back, and more than that, I had enough to burn her story to the ground. Oren showed up at my doorstep just after 9. No knock. Just a long pause outside, then the slow creak of the gate opening. I watched from the window as he stood there, holding a manila envelope like it might bite him. His eyes were sunken, clothes too crisp for someone who hadn't slept. I opened the door, said nothing. He stepped inside without waiting for permission. "I didn't bring copies," he said, setting the envelope on my table like it weighed 50 pounds. "These are the originals." I opened it carefully. Inside, printed minutes from the last 3 board meetings, including the one where Rena claimed interim emergency authority. I flipped through them. No mention of a vote, no motion raised, no record of any quorum, just her handwriting in the margin of the final page. Authority assumed per emergency conditions. And no one else had initialed it. Oren stood behind me, rubbing the back of his neck. She told me to draft it that way, said it would save the board time and streamline liability. He exhaled hard. But there wasn't an emergency until she created one. There it was, not just guilt. Confirmation. She also had me sign off on the community announcement with the board names, said it was standard. I didn't even know we were sending one out until I saw it online. I turned toward him. "You know this makes you a key witness." He didn't flinch. "Yeah. You know the board might try to pin this on you now that the cracks are showing." I figured. I watched him for a long moment. He didn't shrink from it. He looked like a man who'd spent weeks teetering on a line and had finally picked a side, even if he wasn't sure what the cost would be. I nodded once, then reached for my phone and pressed play on the voicemail recording again. Rena's voice filled the room. "Just need Oren to keep quiet until the next review vote. He won't make noise." Oren's eyes flickered. She really said that. Out loud, on a voicemail. And it's time-stamped, backed up, and off-site. His lips twitched, not a smile, something more bitter. I guess I've been quiet long enough. I pulled out the printed report from my own files, the fake bylaw insert, the forensic analysis, the forged time stamps. I slid it across the table and tapped the envelope. Between your documents and mine, we don't just have evidence, we have a roadmap. He nodded. I want immunity, he said. Not for the board stuff, for the internal non-disclosure agreement. It's got language in it that binds me from speaking about board strategy. Rena slipped it into our renewal packets. Most people didn't read it, but she'll try to use it. Then we file with state HOA oversight first, I replied. Not internal resolution, not board arbitration. We go, at outside her chain. I'll testify, Oren said, but I'm not doing it in secret. If this is happening, it's happening in public. I want it on record. Good. He looked down at the table. I should have spoken sooner. If she'd killed your daughter, she didn't. But not because she hesitated. Because her aim was bad. He swallowed. I slid the evidence into a clean folder, labeled it, and locked it in my safe. I'd submit a duplicate to the HOA's legal archive request system, required by statute if any board member provides documentation for procedural irregularities. Once that was in motion, Rena couldn't bury it without committing destruction of official records. And she was already buried in enough. Oren left quietly, his shoulders straighter than when he came in. I watched him go, then turned back to the file spread across my dining table. The pattern was almost complete. Forged authority, illegal amendments, premeditated cover-up, and now an insider willing to testify. She'd frame the shooting as reaction. We'd prove it was policy-driven pretext. And the next board meeting, it wouldn't be about compliance. It would be about exposure. By noon the next day, my living room looked less like a home and more like a command post. Floor plans, photos, and audio logs covered the table. I hadn't eaten, barely slept. But every detail I'd logged since the shooting was now organized, color-coded, and ready to detonate. I started with the scene itself, Sylvan Court. I overlaid the wedding permit map against the HOA's own event layout archive from the previous quarter. Identical boundaries, same arch position, same guest capacity. I circled every approval stamp and printed side-by-side comparisons. If Rena argued unauthorized use, she'd be arguing against her own archive. Next, I reconstructed the shooting itself. I used my field laser tool to recreate the shot angle based on recorded blood drops, guest video timestamps, and Rena's location, 24 feet, 7-degree drop. I loaded the data into my forensic modeling software, rendering a 3D vector path. The simulation showed it all: Rena's position, the flower girl's movement, the bridesmaid's gentle lean, and the clean line from her pistol to Elira's clavicle. I saved the render as a looping animation. Then came the audio. Using a forensic toolchain I'd used back in my CID days, I isolated the ambient recording from the wedding guest's phone and filtered background frequencies until the shot stood out like a crack of thunder on glass. No verbal warning before it, no panic. Just one sharp draw, a safety click, and discharge. I ran the spectrogram analysis. Rena's breathing was steady, unlike the startled reactions around her. That, paired with the lack of warning, would blow her reflexive reaction claim wide open. I labeled it Exhibit C, Audio Profile of Intentional Firearm Discharge. Next, I pulled up the HOA's digital archive and matched it against my saved version from a month prior. In the directory, Rena's Emergency Authority Addendum had no prior version number, no ratified timestamp. The original file didn't even exist until 12:42 p.m. on the wedding day. Metadata doesn't lie. I took screen recordings of my comparisons, highlighting the creation data. Her entire authority rested on a document fabricated hours before the shooting. Exhibit D, bylaw forgery with confirmed metadata tampering. Finally, I cataloged Oren's envelope. His original meeting minutes confirmed no vote took place. Rena's name was the only one on the emergency clause. And now I had a statement from him, handwritten, signed, dated. He was ready to testify. That alone would have cracked the surface. But the full set? It was overkill. And that's exactly what I wanted. I packed the materials into 2 mirrored binders, one for my attorney, one for the state HOA regulatory board. Then I assembled the digital versions, encrypted, time-locked, auto-distributed to cloud and email if anything happened to me or the originals. I moved to Phase 2, triggering the legal obligation for board review. Under Virewood Bluff's Articles of Governance, any board member could trigger a full evidentiary review if evidence of criminal activity, forgery, or policy abuse emerged. And Orrin Hale had already agreed to submit the necessary language. He'd do it within 48 hours. That meant the next board meeting, previously scheduled to discuss landscaping budgets and summer block party permits, would now be legally forced to include a formal presentation of all submitted evidence under state HOA compliance rules. Rena couldn't delay it, couldn't bury it. If she tried, it would trigger automatic escalation to the HOA Oversight Committee at the county level. I printed my witness list, final layout, and timeline. I kept it cold, professional, just the facts. Because what I had wasn't an argument. It was a closed case with receipts, recordings, and rotational vector analysis. I wasn't coming to beg for accountability. I was coming to present the truth. And when it played, frame by frame, angle by angle, no neighbor, no board member, no lawyer in the room would be able to unsee it. The bullet that pierced my daughter's chest had a straight line back to Rena Mallow's arrogance, her hunger for control, and her forged justification. This wasn't just negligence, it was engineered, and I was done giving her time to breathe. The day before the board meeting, I drove to the county records office in downtown Marlin Ridge. The building smelled like old paper and pine disinfectant, sharp, clean, hiding decay beneath protocol. I'd filed plenty of reports here back in my military days. It felt no different now. Bureaucracy hadn't changed, only the targets had. At the front desk, I handed over the sealed envelope addressed to the HOA Regulatory Oversight Division. Inside was the full forensic packet, every document, every timestamp, every voice recording and vector reconstruction logged by sequence and source. A mirrored digital version had already been submitted through the state portal, but I wanted a paper trail with a human signature. The clerk scanned the barcoded slip and slid a stamped confirmation back across the desk. "Would you like a second copy?" she asked. I nodded. "For the hearing." "You're not the first HOA complaint this week," she said quietly. "I'll be the last one for this board." I left and headed straight to the neighborhood library where the community printer still took coins and posted notices on the corkboard walls. In the study room, I sat down to prep the presentation files. The animation went first, a side-by-side comparison of the wedding footage with the 3D forensic render. It showed Rena's posture, muzzle angle, and the entry path of the bullet. Next came the spectrogram overlay, highlighting the moment before the shot. Quiet, uninterrupted, no verbal commands, no alarm, just calm, cold intent. I queued up the voicemail next. Rena's voice again. "I'll have the board back the policy insert I uploaded today. Just need Orrin to keep quiet." Every time I heard that line, it cut deeper. The meeting minutes came next. Orrin's handwritten statement, the metadata screenshots, the compliance side-by-side showing how the fabricated clause appeared and disappeared on demand. I added a witness statement from a neighbor who had heard Rena earlier that day complaining about uncontrolled proximity during the ceremony. She'd filed a note in the neighborhood app, time-stamped 6 hours before the wedding. She was already agitated, already prepared. It wasn't a moment of panic. It was a decision made ahead of time. Outside the library window, I watched a group of kids play in the fountain across the street. They laughed, pushed each other, tossed coins in the water. A ripple of envy passed through me. My daughter should have been on her honeymoon. Instead, she was in a hospital bed. I pushed away the thought and focused. Before I left, I printed a set of QR-coded exhibit references, compact, scannable files, so every board member could follow along. No excuse to ignore what was in front of them, no room to stall. Then I drove back to Virewood Bluffs. I took the long way through the neighborhood, saw familiar houses, familiar cars, but fewer faces. People were keeping to themselves now. Doors stayed shut. Garages opened only halfway before sliding back down. The board had gone quiet, but I hadn't. Back home, I packed the documents into a hardened case and double-checked the backups. Even if the projector failed, even if the board tried to suppress the meeting, I had 3 ways to show the truth. The arch had been removed, but I walked to where it once stood. I knelt, pressed my fingers into the grass, and found the soft indent of the front right support post. Just beneath the soil, I found the metal bracket I'd anchored into the earth to stop it from shifting in wind. I pulled it out, worn, rusted, still intact. I slid it into my case, because that wasn't just hardware, it was proof. The HOA had flagged the arch as unapproved, but that bracket had been cleared by the structural subcommittee and stamped with their HOA seal. Their logo was still etched into the side. Another contradiction, another nail in the coffin. Tomorrow, I'd walk into the boardroom not as a grieving father, not even as a former investigator. I'd walk in as a witness, with evidence so clean it couldn't be spun. And Rena Mallow, she'd walk out changed, or not at all. The boardroom felt smaller than usual. Maybe it was the folding chairs they had dragged in from the community center. Maybe the way people sat shoulder to shoulder instead of spaced apart like usual. But I think it was the silence. You could feel it, thick, tight, humming just under the skin of the room. Nobody was smiling, nobody was talking. Even the ones who normally whispered behind cupped hands sat still. Rena Mallow entered last. She wore her standard slate gray blazer, Virewood Bluffs logo, pinned perfectly above her name tag. Her posture screamed control, calculated. She didn't look at me. She looked through me, like I was just another problem on her agenda. She brought with her 2 file folders and a printed agenda with limited discussion written in bold red font at the top. Her attempt to steer the narrative before it began. But it wasn't hers to control anymore. Orrin Hale was already seated at the table's edge, his eyes down, a binder in his lap. When I walked in, he didn't nod, didn't flinch, but his foot tapped against the tile, a steady rhythm that didn't stop until the meeting began. Rena opened with a hollow smile. "Thank you all for coming on short notice. We've had a series of, unfortunate incidents, and the board has prepared a formal response." She motioned to Corin Vestal, the compliance officer, who tried to hand out her printed packets. No one reached for them. I stood. "Actually, I'll be starting." The board stiffened. Rena's hand hovered near her packet, but she didn't interrupt. Not yet. This meeting was triggered by a formal submission under HOA Code 8.3, Clause D, Compelled Review Proceedings, I said. Per policy, any attempt to obstruct evidence presentation will constitute procedural interference and be reported to the county compliance auditor. That was a warning. A clean one. Rena didn't move. I stepped to the front of the room and set my hard case on the floor. One by one, I pulled out the binders, set them on the board table, and powered up the tablet with the first projection file. The screen flickered to life. First, the side-by-side video. Wedding footage on the left. Forensic animation on the right. Both synced. Both clear. Rena in the corner, hand moving. No verbal command. No visible threat. Just a draw and a shot. The room breathed in slow. Next, the audio spectrogram. Click, play. The waveform pulsed, steady, uneventful ambient noise. Then the spike, gunfire, no preceding shout, no signal of escalation. "This is Exhibit C," I said calmly, "captured by a wedding guest and authenticated by chain of custody timestamps." I didn't need to say what it showed. Everyone could see it. Then the metadata logs, the bylaw file, the fabricated emergency clause, its creation timestamp, hours before the wedding, its backdated claim of ratification, never supported by meeting minutes. The screen lit up with the comparison table, the original bylaw version, the forged one, the inserted section 4.3.1 that had never existed until the day of the shooting, and finally the audio file, Rena's voice. "I'll have the board back the policy insert I uploaded today. Just need Orrin to keep quiet until the next review vote." The room stayed quiet through the playback, but the shift was seismic, shoulders tensed. A woman 2 rows back pressed a tissue to her mouth. Someone near the back whispered, "She really said that?" I let the silence stretch. Then Orrin stood. He opened his binder and read, voice even but quiet. No vote occurred to instate Rena Mallow as interim president. No proxy was submitted. No emergency clause was ratified. The event risk addendum was not authorized by board consensus. All minutes on file reflect this. He passed the statement to the HOA record keeper and sat down. Rena finally spoke. This is a coordinated attack on the board's authority, and frankly, it borders on slander. I clicked one final file, the stamped approval for the wedding arch, structural sign-off, HOA logo embedded, signed by the same committee that now claimed it never existed. Then you slandered yourself. Rena stared, lips pressed thin. But her eyes? They'd finally moved. She looked scared. The silence didn't last. It shattered under the weight of too many truths, exposed all at once. People started murmuring, loud enough this time to feel like a current moving through the room. The tension wasn't speculative anymore. It was real, documented, tethered to signatures and timestamps. Neighbors who'd once sat politely in folding chairs were now leaning forward, whispering to each other like they'd just been handed the map to a house that had always felt haunted. Rena tried to retake control. "This meeting is unauthorized in its current format," she said, raising her voice slightly. "The exhibits have not been verified through official HOA counsel, and That's incorrect," I cut in. "Per HOA code, any submitted evidence tied to a compelled review proceeding is valid upon notarized delivery, and all files were submitted to the county records office yesterday." I held up the stamped receipt. She froze, the words stalling in her throat. Corin, seated next to her, pulled the receipt toward himself, scanning it. I watched the color drain from his face. "This was submitted to the oversight board?" he asked her quietly. Rena didn't answer. Someone from the back stood. It was Mr. Darden, an older man who'd lived in Virewood Bluffs since it was built. He pointed toward the screen. "You use that made-up clause to justify drawing a gun?" he asked, voice low, trembling. "On a girl standing under a wedding arch?" Rena didn't look at him. She turned her focus to me instead, like I was the enemy here. "I acted under the protocols available to me," she said. "There was movement near the children, unfamiliar faces. A guest reached too quickly. I had reason to—" "There was no threat," another neighbor cut in. "We saw the footage. You didn't even flinch." "She was calm," someone else added. "Too calm." A third voice. "She had her hand on the holster before anything happened." The room was slipping from her. For someone who spent years controlling every minor violation, from lawn colors to porch light wattage, Rena Malu was suddenly the only one without a rule to hide behind. She tried again. "Let's be careful not to jump to conclusions. This is being taken out of context, and—" "Out of context?" Orrin said, louder than I'd ever heard him speak. "You wrote a policy that doesn't exist. You filed it hours before the shooting, and then you used it to justify almost killing someone." Rena's mask cracked. "You signed it," she snapped. Orrin didn't blink. "No. You had me sign a board attendance form. You slipped the clause in later. I didn't authorize it." Rena turned to the rest of the board, eyes scanning for anyone who might back her up. But no one moved. They sat in silence, hands folded, eyes lowered. Not loyal, not anymore. Corin cleared his throat, glanced sideways at her. "Rena, we were told that policy was voted on last month." "It was," she lied again, too fast. "It wasn't in the minutes," he said quietly. "Not in mine, not in the official logs." Her face hardened. "I did what I had to do." A beat passed. I stepped forward and laid down one final piece of paper. A copy of the letter I'd submitted to the county, listing the HOA board by name and requesting an official compliance hearing. This document lists the forged clause, the falsified authority, and the resulting injury to a member of my family. As of today, all materials are under review by the county's legal counsel and the HOA Oversight Committee. You won't be able to bury this with board votes. Someone clapped, then another, and another. Not loud, not a standing ovation. Just sharp, deliberate hands meeting hands. Not to celebrate, just to confirm that everyone saw what they saw. Rena stood like she meant to walk out. But before she could take a step, Officer Hale from the Marlin Ridge PD stepped in from the back. "Ms. Mallow," he said, "you're being placed under temporary administrative hold, pending review of criminal negligence, forgery of community policy, and discharge of an unlicensed firearm within a restricted zone." She didn't speak, she just sat down. And for the first time since the shot rang out under that driftwood arch, Virewood Bluffs felt quiet for the right reason. They escorted her out through the side door. No handcuffs yet, just two officers flanking her like walls. Rena didn't look back. She didn't argue, didn't shout. She just walked, stiff, head held high, like she still believed she could reason her way out of the truth that finally caught her. The rest of the board sat frozen, a silent jury who'd run out of excuses. Orrin rubbed the bridge of his nose, eyes wet, the weight of everything finally showing. When the door closed, no one clapped this time. The tension wasn't about victory anymore. It was relief, the kind that comes when a long sickness finally ends. I stood for a moment, staring at the space she'd left behind. The binder of exhibits sat open on the table, the images of the wedding still paused on the screen behind me. I walked over, picked up the remote, and froze the frame on one shot, just before the moment everything went wrong. My daughter standing barefoot under the arch, laughing, veil lifting slightly in the wind. The shot hadn't been fired yet. It was still just light and air. That's what I wanted to remember. The board adjourned without ceremony. Neighbors filed out quietly, whispering apologies, condolences, offers to help. I didn't need any of that. I just wanted to go home. Outside, the sun was already setting, low and warm across the brick paths of Virewood Bluffs. The same paths Rena used to patrol with a clipboard and fake authority. Now, those footsteps would be replaced by police and auditors and, eventually, new elections. I knew what came next: depositions, hearings, endless procedural knots, but for once, they'd be knots tightening around the right person. Orrin caught up to me in the parking lot. "She'll try to settle," he said quietly. "She'll try," I replied. "But the Oversight Committee has the originals, and so does the county." He nodded, his voice cracked. "I'm sorry it took me this long." I looked at him for a moment before answering. "It took just long enough." He left before I could say anything else. Maybe he couldn't bear the sound of gratitude tied to guilt. When I got home, the house was still. Devin had sent a message earlier, "She's awake." My chest tightened as I reread it. Just 2 words, but they landed heavier than anything that had come before. I drove to the hospital without even changing clothes. The machines were quieter this time, their steady rhythm almost comforting. Elira's eyes fluttered open when I stepped in. She looked tired, pale, but alive. When she smiled, it was small, careful. "Hey," she whispered. "Hey yourself," I said, trying not to let my voice crack. She lifted her hand weakly and I held it. The skin around her wrist was thin, the IV tape pulling at it slightly. For a long time, we didn't talk. There wasn't much to say that words could carry properly. Finally, she asked, "Did she say sorry?" "No," I told her, "but the law will." Her lips curved again, faint but real. Then she closed her eyes, and I let her rest. On my way out, I stopped by the hospital garden. The air smelled like rain and disinfectant, clean but heavy. The benches were wet, but I sat anyway. I thought of the driftwood arch, how she'd wanted to use that old pier wood from the lake house, how I'd built it for her just to feel close to her mother again. The HOA had torn it down, but pieces of it were still in my garage, stacked against the wall. I'd kept them without even thinking. Maybe I'd rebuild it, not as an arch this time, but as a bench, something solid, something that wouldn't collapse under noise or rules or signatures. Maybe that would be enough. By the time I drove back home, lights glowed in a few windows across the neighborhood. People were talking again, but differently. The fear had shifted into something like accountability. The board would never be the same, and that meant the community wouldn't either. I stood on the porch and looked at the empty patch of grass where the arch once stood. The ground was healing, growing back over the marks. Maybe that was fitting. Maybe that's what justice really looked like, not triumph, just slow restoration. If you've ever watched someone abuse power until it breaks something sacred, you know the sound it makes when truth hits back. It isn't loud, it's steady, relentless. And it doesn't stop once it starts. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?